Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers. Season 3, Episode 1, the one about feminist theology. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. To start off Season 3 with a massive bang, I have invited Nikki McGee to talk to us. For any RE teachers on Twitter, you will almost have certainly come across this amazing woman. Nikki McGee is a subject specialist lead for religion and philosophy at Inspiration East, a teacher, a NATRE executive, that's the National Association of Teachers for RE, a mother, an avid reader and a foodie. I genuinely don't know how she fits everything in. We connected on Twitter, and my impression of her is that she is someone who is passionate about the subject of RE and passionate about inspiring and supporting the RE community. I knew I had to have her on the RE podcast, so welcome, Nikki.
Thank you. My husband would say I don't do housework. That's how I'd manage it.
You've got to make the sacrifice, and I think that's a good one. So, for any of our listeners who don't know who you are, who is Nikki McGee?
So, as you've just said, I'm the subject specialist lead for Inspiration Trust in Norfolk, and that's a job I've recently taken up. I'm a newbie and moved to Norfolk to take that job in September. But me personally, I see myself as a bit of a social justice feminist warrior with some fluffy edges. And like lots of us, I was really shaped by my childhood. But as in, I looked at my childhood and I knew that I wanted something different, both for me and if I was to have any children of my own. So my childhood was just highly dysfunctional, very unpleasant, quite violent. And I didn't have any female role models I can remember. There were women around me, and I'm not criticising these women, but they weren't women that I looked up to and thought I want to be like that. And so I've spent much of my life looking for female role models. And I also knew, in fact, I can remember thinking this really clearly when I was about 15, that I really wanted something different and that I had two ways out. And I could choose the route that lots of girls from Blackpool choose, unfortunately, which was to get pregnant, or I could work really hard at school and get to university. And I chose going to university. And I knew that education could be my way out. And it was a way of me breaking for myself and my children generations of poverty and dysfunction. And I really passionately wanted to be a mum, but I wanted to be a role model if I had a daughter in particular. And whilst I know that I've made mistakes, I really hope that I've inspired her a little bit with some strength and resilience and McGee grit, but also given her some of the sort of softness and emotion that I didn't get. I'm also someone who loves feeling part of a community. And I think that comes from not feeling like I fitted in as a child. So in my past, that was being part of a religious community was very important to me. More recently, being involved in politics and feminism has been where I found that community. So that's me.
And I think what we want to talk about today is this sort of idea of feminism, and we'll come back to that in a second. But I'm particularly interested, I think a lot of our listeners are going to really understand how that feels to be brought up in that sort of family. But what was it, do you think, that inspired you to make positive change and that gave you the strength to not follow in the footsteps of your family or what was normal in that culture and in that time? What was it that inspired you to take a more positive action and go to university?
I'm incredibly stubborn. My husband is from a very similar background to me, and it's a conversation that we have. And both of us are incredibly stubborn, which makes married life at times interesting and challenging. And I think I had enough to get me to university. And then when I got to university, I just saw that life could be completely different from what I had experienced. And my first year at uni was really difficult because I recognised I knew my life wasn't like everyone else's, but it really came home to me just what an awful start I'd had. And I had, when I went to uni, I kind of mixed with people who liked doing the things that I liked. And so they read books and they enjoyed them. I lived in my second year, I lived in a house with all female housemates. And I found that incredibly empowering to be surrounded by other women. And, they gave me books to read, like Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit and Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch. And they were the two books that were really, really influential on me growing up. I also had, looking back, some really good teachers. Sadly, the ones I remember aren't female. They're male, but I had a really good GCSE, RE and history teacher. And both of them spotted that, yes, I missed a lot of school and I was quite badly behaved. And they never really excused it, but they made an effort to reach out to me. And I had a great, just the most fantastic A-level RE teacher. And I was almost booted out of my sixth form college because I was having to work while I was doing my A-levels. And I worked during the day, so my attendance was below 50%. And so I was kicked off my history A-level and I wanted to be a history teacher. And I thought everything was up, everything was over. But my teacher, who was called Mr. Boardman, he just saw something in me and he invited me in for a chat. And I thought that he was going to tell me off. And instead he said to me, I think if you kind of upped your attendance a bit and did a bit more work, you could apply to Oxford. And I was someone who was clinging on to the idea of getting to any university. But when he said that to me, I was just so touched that someone had spotted something in me and that they could overlook the mistakes that I was making. And he started lending me books. I had sessions after school where he prepped me for the interview. And, I owe him a lot of thanks, actually, because he gave me a real boost in confidence when I needed it.
And it shows just how important our job can be, that it's not just about education. It's about seeing into those children and seeing potential and helping people to reach it.
Yes.
So it's almost serendipitous that you ended up being an RE teacher then, because it wasn't really your plan, but you had this amazing role model and the history kind of didn't work out. And I'm reminded of a quote that says, sometimes life stops you from achieving your dreams. Or no, what was it? Sometimes life saves you from what you want. And actually what's happened is that actually something negative was turned into something positive. So just talk about that sort of journey to becoming an RE teacher.
So then I went to university. I didn't take up my place at Oxford. I was offered a place, but I was dreadfully intimidated by it. And so I turned my place down. And that's something that has stuck with me. And I've been very passionate ever since then about empowering kids like me to apply for the best university and then to flipping take the place.
Yes.
But I went to King's, and I actually think in London that was the right choice for me, because I think I was very overawed at King's, so I don't know how I would have coped at Oxford, to be honest. So I did my degree in theology. My Hebrew tutor was Dr. Larkin, who had a real interest in feminist theology. And when you do theology at King's, well, I'd imagine like most places, you have to do Greek and Hebrew. And I was awful at Greek. And in fact, I scored 28% in the end of my first year exams. And Professor Stanton, who was wonderful, said to me that actually wasn't too bad, because when he checked my register, I'd attended 25% of lectures. So he said, you've actually learnt 3% on your own. So I hated Greek, but I loved Hebrew. And I think I loved Hebrew because it was an all-female class and I felt safe and empowered. And we just had conversations about women in the Bible and what it was like to be a woman that really set me up for life. And so I did quite well at uni. I graduated with a 2-1. And then I had a real crisis of confidence and didn't know what I wanted to do. My plan had always been to teach, but only because I don't come from a family where people have jobs, never mind good jobs. And so because I'd been to school, I knew what a teacher was. So that was literally my career plan. I'm going to be a job that I know what it is. I had no idea of how much I would earn or, hours, or it was madness looking back. But I didn't even have the confidence to do that. And so I managed bookmakers. I cleaned bookmakers. I worked in retail for about a year. I remember one afternoon I had a conversation on the shop floor. I was working for WH Smith's, and it was a really long conversation about where to put pencil sharpeners on the shop floor. And I could just remember thinking, this isn't why I've done a degree. This isn't why I've got all this debt, because although I got, a grant, you still leave with some debt, and I want to do something else. And so I went home that afternoon and got what would have been a UCAS form and applied to do a PGCE in London. applied at King's and was told that I was absolutely rubbish and he wasn't what I was looking for. But he looked at me and he said, my sister, who's Angela Wright, runs the PGCE at the Institute of Education and she will love you. So that's your next choice. I suggest that you go there. And so I did. And I got my place and I just loved it. My first day of teaching, which was at Haberdasher Aske's in London, was because the whole RE department had called in sick. And so I was called in to some deputy head's office and they said to me, you're the RE department now, Nikki. And I was, and I loved it and just never, ever really looked back. It was just what I was meant to do.
What is it that you love about RE?
I just find it fascinating. I come from an Irish Catholic background and my stepdad was Polish Catholic. And so I just find the way that religious beliefs shape people's identity and what they do, I just find it totally fascinating. And for a long time, I was teaching with faith, and so I found that fascinating. But I lost my faith a few years ago. But I just think religion is at the heart of what it is to be human, and people are fascinating, and so religion is fascinating.
And why do you think it's such an important subject in the 21st century?
Because I don't think there is much space in everyday life for the metaphysical, and we provide a little window to that. And even if you don't have a faith in God, there is more to life than the physical. And I just love the conversations that I have with our students that I know that they don't get anywhere else. And as I said, because RE is fundamentally about what it is to be human, and for some people, being human involves a relationship with or being in the image of God, and for other people it doesn't. RE enables you to have really important conversations about your identity, and we don't always have the space to have those conversations as adults. And so I feel really privileged that young people get the chance to have those conversations with me.
Absolutely. And can I just ask why or how you lost your faith?
I suspect I was never really a great Christian, to be honest. I was interested in the social aspect of it, not just as in community, but in the sort of, the charity work and trying to work in my community and trying to improve lives of people. And the belief was never really that strong, if I'm being honest. And I always felt a little bit awkward about it. But I loved the community, so I stuck with it. And then about 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. The diagnosis actually came on my little boy's first birthday. And it had taken me and my husband 10 years to conceive our little boy. And I can just remember being really angry that, if God existed, and it does sound like your typical Year 9 argument against God existing, but for me, it was real. If God existed, why would this be happening? And because I was at the time part of a church, lots of people were saying to me constantly, I will pray for you. And that didn't bring me comfort. And in fact, it started to irritate me. And all of those offers of prayer came from a good place. They came from a place of love. And I tried to see it in that way, but I could feel this resentment building in me. And so I left. And I miss it a lot, actually. I wish I could get that back because I miss that sense of belonging and that sense of community. And it might be something that in a few years I get back. But right now it's too raw. And I'm still, 4 or 5 years later, still quite angry about it.
Yeah. And I think so many people listening will relate to that this doesn't seem to be the world that would result from an all-powerful, all-loving God. And you look at the amount of suffering and needless suffering and the suffering of innocence, and it's very, very hard to reconcile that. And so I think a lot of people are going to be nodding along. So thank you for sharing that with us. The reason I've got you on is because of your passion for feminist theology. Can you first of all just tell us, break it down for us, Nikki, what is feminist theology?
So for me, feminist theology is about just putting women back into the narrative. I just have a real sense that we've been stripped out of it. And so, for me in particular, who's looking for those strong female role models I didn't have as a child, I want to find them in religion and elsewhere. But also it's about taking pride in being a woman and thinking about what it is to be a woman. And if religion is about what it is to be human, religion must be very important for women when they're thinking about what is it to be a woman? What is my experience of being a woman?
You said there that feminist theology is about trying to bring women back into the discourse. Where have they been taken out? Can you give us a specific example of something which traditionally or maybe sort of historically has kind of removed the feminine from theology?
Do you ever wonder what your life purpose is and how you're going to reach it? Or hear someone talking about energy work and wonder what it's all about? Well, come and join us on Balm to the Soul. My name is Natasha Joy Price, and my guests and I talk all things spiritual, how we know what our life purpose is and how we get on the right path to achieve it. We talk about energy healing modalities, past life, hypnosis, inner child work, crystals, light language, breath work, and so much more. We also talk about how we clean our own energy in order to find a more balanced and centered way of living. If any of that resonates with you, come and join us on Balm to the Soul.
So I recently read Dolores Williams' Sisters in the Wilderness, and which is her reconstruction of the life of Hagar. And there are women in the Old Testament. So, for example, I love the story of Ruth, but often women are seen through the eyes of men, or they're seen because of their relationship to men. And I really love the way that Dolores Williams rebuilds up the story of Hagar and stops her being a victim, because again, a lot of women in the Bible, I think, are presented as victims. And she presents her as this powerful black woman who's not to be messed with, who perhaps has gone on to lead her own tribe. And if anybody can tell me of more books like that, I would love to read them. I just think that there are powerful women in the Bible and other religious texts, but the patriarchy has stripped their story away. And I think one of the jobs of feminist theologians who know much, much more than me is to rebuild those stories.
Yeah, and I'm thinking a particular one. I'm looking at the story of the fall. So I'm looking at Adam and Eve, and I'm looking at the role of both men and women in that, but also the interpretation of that story and the impact it's had on the church. How do you understand that story and the role of Eve in human history?
I just think it's just awful. I love the way that Mary Daly presents it, where she talks about Eve's the one that goes for the knowledge, and then she's punished for it forevermore. And just the whole story makes me very, very angry. I struggle when I teach it to teach it in a manner that isn't done with sort of sarcasm and anger, really. You know, even when Adam is told off, he's told off for listening to his woman. You know, that's what happens when you listen to women. You know, the whole of humanity downfalls. But Eve, and in some way Mary, for me, they've set the template for women that is not helpful. And so we need to rework those stories so that they are helpful for women.
And actually, to use Eve as a role model for gaining knowledge.
Yes.
You know, I think it's such an interesting interpretation that I've only really thought about in the last year because I read The Devil's Apocrypha. So it just reworks that story to say that actually, why were we not allowed to have knowledge? Why was that seen as something that was negative? And I think to actually turn that on its head, I just think it's a real message to women out there to educate yourself and know things and to feel worthy of knowledge.
Yes.
Which is interesting because that's almost your story, isn't it? That you didn't feel worthy of knowledge and you didn't feel worthy to understand and know things and challenge yourself academically. So it's wonderful. What do you think of verses in the Bible like women submit to your husband?
I have a real issue with St. Paul. And I know that he is talking to a very particular context at a very particular time. So, you know, for example, in 1 Corinthians, you know, he's writing to a particular church. And so, you know, maybe when he tells women to be quiet in church, or he tells women in other letters to submit to their husbands, you know, maybe they were particularly loud, dominating women. I don't have a problem with loud, dominating women. Many people would say that I'm one myself. But I think that we're too quick to excuse St. Paul and say, you know, he's a product of his patriarchal context. And, you know, also in the quote that talks about there's neither male nor female, nor slave nor free, again, it's almost like St. Paul is saying, I can overlook that you're a woman. Why should you overlook that I'm a woman? That's fabulous being a woman. We never overlook somebody being a man. But I also think we have to be really careful that when, as white privileged women, we read those passages and dismiss them and say, oh, don't worry about that, it's not relevant, when it actually is relevant. Because, women are, to quote Mary Daly's Unholy Trinity, women are still being used as, weapons in war. There's still genocide. Women are still being raped in this country and abroad. And, these texts can be used, if not the exact text, the attitude is used to excuse it. And I think we have to be very careful when talking about a place of privilege of saying, I'm going to overlook that bit of sexism or racism or homophobia in a text because it might not affect you personally when it does affect people, in other parts of the world or in other circumstances. I'm part of the Black Theology reading group, and I read recently a writing from the Black Women's Feminist Circle, Mercy Aduye, and she really opened my eyes to some of the awful situations that young girls find themselves exposed to, being sold off into sexual slavery. And I just had no idea that this was going on. And so, as I said, we need to be careful in excusing St. Paul and saying it doesn't matter now, no one thinks that, because sadly lots of men do.
And I think it's interesting, isn't it, that I've seen that verse as there is no male, there is no female, we're all one in Christ, as a sort of uplifting, positive thing. But actually, you're right, then it overlooks gender and it doesn't see gender. And if you don't see gender, then you're not seeing the experience of women. And we're living in a context where, we've got statistics being thrown around that 97% of women have been sexually harassed, and that there is an increasing acceptance of rape culture. And we're talking about male privilege. And so these subtleties of sort of influences that we've got from the Bible need to be challenged and need to be thought about if we're going to move forward. How do you see the role of men and women in the church?
I don't know. I struggle with that, really. I think women should... I would like to think, and I'm saying this as somebody who has left the church, and so I feel like a hypocrite saying it, but for a long time, I was someone who wanted to be a reformer within the church. I was within the Roman Catholic Church, and then I left the Roman Catholic Church after I got divorced, and then I joined the Church of England. And, I always tried to take active roles within those churches and be quite visible and to, speak my feminist truth, if you like. But it got to a point where I felt like I couldn't do that anymore. But yeah, both men and women have got to be part of change. But I do think that women have to get the change for themselves. I think that's part of the process of creating change. I want us to get it for ourselves. I don't want it to be given to us like a wrapped up gift from a man.
And therefore, let's take that one step further. What role do you think RE has in the dialogue about feminist theology?
I think it's really important that we present our students with a range of ways of being religious and reading texts. And I think that very much feeds into the current discussion about worldviews. And as a teacher, that's something I find fascinating to do, is to keep presenting students with the same text. So, for example, the Exodus narratives or the story of Hagar and Abraham, and to say, let's read this with a feminist eye. Now let's read this through the eyes of a black theologian. Now let's read this through the eyes of a womanist theologian. Let's read this through the eyes of someone who is a refugee. And I think feminist theology is going to be part of that multiple readings of texts or experiences through different lenses. And whilst it's not my job to make everyone a feminist, although I would quite like to, it is my job to make them aware that is an option within the field of faith.
I think that's fascinating, and it's something I've never done in a lesson. But I think I'd love to do that, is to get one piece of text or one biblical story, and everyone just wears different hats. It's like, right, let's wear a female hat, or let's wear our refugee hat. Because that's what we want to do. We want people to see the world through different eyes. That's what we do as RE teachers, is to try and understand how the world looks through a different lens. And actually, that's such a beautiful thing that we could all do, I think, within our classes. One sort of thing I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, Nikki, is that we don't really live in a world anymore where we have this binary male and female. And I'm just wondering how the idea of non-binary fits into this conversation.
It's something I struggle with a little bit because I am so aware of my identity as a woman. And, my confidence as a woman came quite late. And so it's something I'm still enjoying and celebrating. However, I think everybody should be treated with compassion and that we are different and diverse. But it is something that I struggle to understand because it's beyond my experience. And so it's something I need to learn about.
So I think anybody that's listening to this that feels that they have an important message that brings this idea of non-binary to this discussion of gender, I think we'd all learn a huge amount because it's outside of our experience. And I think you're right, just that idea of compassion is the centre of all of it. And now I need to ask you, who is your sort of role model, your female role model? Who is the woman that has inspired you or women that have inspired you so far?
My ultimate role model, and she comes with challenges because she said some controversial things, is Mary Daly. And she was someone that I read initially at university and then came back to when I was teaching at A-level and then at various points in my life. And I just love her attitude of, I'm just not taking this. And as someone who has grown up watching women, and again, I'm not judging them, but watching women take a lot of rubbish. And myself as a young woman, because I've been conditioned into being an obedient woman, I guess, I took a lot of rubbish when I was younger that I shouldn't have done. And so it was really empowering to read about a woman who said, that is enough. I'm just going to leave. And in some ways, her story sort of mirrors mine because in her early writings, Mary Daly, like me, has a Catholic background. And in her early writings, she's a reformer. But it gets to a point where she just says, women and Christianity don't work. And so we're going to leave and we're going to do something different. And I just found that hugely empowering and inspiring. And that message of, don't just sin, go and sin big. And I just think it's such a fabulous message. But also, one of the things that she's known for is for refusing to admit men into some of her lectures. She's often much misunderstood because it wasn't all of her lectures. And there are stories you can find about Mary Daly being incredibly kind to both men and women. But she was a believer in women having their own safe spaces. And as someone who is incredibly proud of being a woman, but also loves female company, that's something that I identify with. And I love I love men. I'm married to a really lovely man, but I love being in the company of other women. And it takes me back to being at university and being in my Hebrew lectures, where it was myself and a few other women, girls my age, and our feminist Hebrew lecturer, and being in that very empowering all-female environment. And that was something that was important to Mary Daly, and it's something that's important to me. I also love how she challenges some of the role models that were given in the Bible of both men and also women of being scapegoats. Even going to the incarnation and Jesus, where he is presented as someone who suffers for us, and we admire that. And Mary Daly, a bit like Dolores Williams, challenges that and says that is not a useful framework for many women, where suffering is part of our everyday experience, or being marginalised is part of our everyday experience. And we need a role model, someone to look up to who's putting themselves centre stage and is taking power rather than suffering for others. And also, her critique of Mary. And as someone who went to a girls' convent school, we all grew up and we were fascinated by Mary. But actually, she's beyond what we can do. The very setup of Mary is that she is a mother and a virgin. It's not realistic. No matter how hard we try, we can't be like her. And so the Bible, when it does present us with female role models, and there aren't that many of them, they're either Eve, who's to blame for everything, and, shouldn't have had the nerve to seek knowledge, or it's Mary, who is an impossible role model.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting what you say there, and I think anybody that's listening, and of whatever gender, if you're being controlled by somebody, if someone is taking away your power, if someone is taking away your voice, if people are encouraging you to suffer, that actually to have strength to stand up and to fight that and to feel empowered. I think that's a beautiful and important message for all of us. If I could just ask before we go, if you could wake up tomorrow and one thing was different, what would you want that one thing to be?
I'd quite like a female pope. I think don't think that's going to happen tomorrow, is it? But yeah, I would quite like a really, maybe I should go for female Archbishop of Canterbury. Maybe that would be more realistic for now. But I would just love to see, and there are some already, some really, really strong, powerful female role models within all religions.
And I think, the Pope's very recently come out in support of women leaders within the Catholic Church. And I think a lot of people don't feel that's gone far enough, but it is an important step in the right direction. So yes, you're right. It might not happen tomorrow, but they're on a journey where, that's possible at some point in history. They're on that path, hopefully, to that. And is there any final thoughts, anything you'd like to leave our listeners with as we close? No,
just that I think we're incredibly lucky to be part of the RE community. I think it's a really exciting time for the RE community. There's, conversations going on about taking a worldviews approach. And I think that links in with diversity and, links in with racial diversity and also raising the voices of women and other marginalised groups. And so I think it's just a really, really exciting time. And aren't we lucky for doing our job right now?
Absolutely. And I think certainly what's going to come out of this sort of recent census, I think, is going to radically change RE in the future. I know that anyone listening that wants to connect with you on Twitter, you're very gracious with your time and you love talking to people and connecting with people. So I'll encourage people to look you up on Twitter. And obviously, if you've got any questions for Nikki or for the RE podcast, then please tweet us at the RE podcast 1. And I think you are at Nikki McGee. Am I right?
Yes, RE_McGee.
There we go. We'd love to hear from you, love to connect with you. Nikki, thank you so much for being part of the RE podcast today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is. We just proved it to you. But thank you so much for listening to us. Bore the life out of you.